Chapter 11, Fundamentals of the Nervous System and Nervous Tissue.
There are three overlapping functions of the nervous system: sensory input, integration, and motor output. Sensory input is when information is carried from the outside environment to the brain. For example, when a person sees a bug, the information gets sent to the brain, and we understand we are seeing a bug. Integration is what the brain decides to do with the information. So when we see the bug, our brain decides whether it needs to respond or not. Motor output is sent away from the brain to the muscles and acts accordingly. If you were scared, you would jump away from the bug.
The organization of the nervous system. There are two parts to the nervous system. There is the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system contains the brain and the spinal cord. The brain is considered the command center and decides what to do with information. The spinal cord has two major jobs. One job is to create pathways to and from the brain and also houses reflexes. The peripheral nervous system contains the cranial and spinal nerves and also sensory receptors. Cranial nerves communicate information from the brain to other parts of the body. Spinal nerves communicate information from the spinal cord to the body. When you think sensory receptors, think of the five senses: touch, taste, smell, hearing, and sight. Functional subdivisions of the peripheral nervous system. The PNS, which is the peripheral nervous system, has a couple of parts to it: the sensory division and the motor division. Sensory division has two parts: somatic and visceral sensory. Somatic sensory keeps track of touch and the position of joints, which are voluntary movements, such as moving your hand. Visceral sensory has to do with the internal organs, which are involuntary movements, such as digestion. Motor division has a couple of parts also. Motor demands carry commands from the brain to the body. Now, the somatic nervous system involves voluntary responses, while the autonomic nervous system covers involuntary responses. The autonomic nervous system branches into the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. Sympathetic is the flight response that the body has. It raises blood pressure and heart rate, and also involves adrenaline, which is epinephrine and norepinephrine combined. Parasympathetic nervous system slows down heart rate and slows respiration down and increases digestive activity.
Histology of nervous tissue. Supporting cells are also known as neuroglia. There are four types of neuroglia in the central nervous system. Astrocytes are star-shaped and are responsible for controlling the neurons. They are the most common. They keep capillaries close to the neurons and also clean excess ions in the environment. Microglia is another word for macrophages, which is a fancy word, and it eats invaders and cellular debris. Ependymal cells are little cilia that move cerebral spinal fluid, and they also make cerebral spinal fluid. Oligodendrocytes form a myelin sheath in the central nervous system. They also speed up impulses because a myelinated neuron is faster than an unmyelinated neuron. There are two types of neuroglia in the peripheral nervous system. In the left picture, you'll see satellite cells. These are there for the support of the neuron. On the right side, you will see neurolemnocytes, or also known as Schwann cells, and they actually do the myelination of the peripheral nervous system.
Functional characteristics of a neuron include the ability to conduct impulses, which means they send messages and also repolarize and depolarize a neuron. A neuron is also amniotic, which means the neuron can't divide. The neuron also has a high metabolic rate, which means that it needs oxygen and glucose to function. The three functional components of a neuron start with the input region, which is the dendrites and cell body. Those carry information into the neuron. The conducting components carry the actual action potential, which then leads to the secretory component, which is the end of the neuron, also known as the axon terminal. Neuron anatomy. The cell body is made up of a few parts. The cell body is also known as the soma. Nissl bodies are what make up proteins. Neurofibrils and neurofilaments are what maintain cell shape. An axon hillock is the area that generates the action potential itself. Processes which stick out of a neuron include the axon, which are tracts in the CNS and nerves in the PNS. Dendrites form a receptive region that carry graded potentials. An axon also has many parts to it. The axolemma is the membrane on the axon. It transports across an axon and can be antegrade or retrograde. Antegrade means that the impulse is going towards the axon terminal, and retrograde means it's going towards the cell body.
Myelinated means the messages move faster, and unmyelinated means they will move slower. White matter is what makes up myelinated axons, and gray matter makes up unmyelinated neurons. Nodes of Ranvier are the spaces between Schwann cells and oligodendrocytes, and bipolar neurons only have two processes sticking out of the body. Multipolar neurons means there are three or more processes out of the cell body. Unipolar neurons carry sensory information into the central nervous system. Functional classifications of neurons also include interneurons, which are the most common and make up most of the central nervous system. These relay information between other neurons. Also included are sensory and motor neurons.
Neurophysiology have a couple of basic electrical principles. Some subunits of this is voltage. Voltage is the difference in charge between 2 points. A current is a flow of electrons from one point to another. Resistance slows down or stops the flow of electrons. And selective permeability of a plasma membrane means that some things can get through the membrane. Electrochemical gradients are when more of a chemical ion is on one side than the other. There are passive channels and active channels. Passive channels are open all the time, while active channels can be opened and closed. Chemically gated open when neurotransmitters sit on them, found in dendrites. Voltage-gated axons are when they need to be shocked to open. A resting membrane potential occurs when there is an unequal amount of ions across the membrane. A sodium-potassium pump maintains electrochemical gradients, which is also a resting membrane potential, and keeps things uneven. It pumps 3 sodiums into and 2 potassiums in, and ATP is always needed. Membrane potentials that act as signals. There's depolarization and hyperpolarization. Depolarization is the reduction in membrane potential, and it makes the resting membrane potential closer to 0, and that means there's no polarization. Hyperpolarization makes the resting membrane potential negative. A resting membrane potential is always at negative 70 millivolts. Types of signals. Graded potentials cause action potentials and are either hyperpolarized or depolarized, and are found in dendrites and the cell body, and can be strong or weak. Action potentials are nervous impulses and are only in axons. The generation of an action potential can be in a resting state, which is the voltage gate channels that are closed, or depolarized, which is when the sodium gates are open. The threshold for that is negative 55 millivolts, that's when an action potential happens. That's the threshold for it. When repolarization happens, there's a decrease in the sodium permeability and an increase in the potassium permeability. And then restoration of resting state ionic distribution happens, which is the sodium-potassium pump. Propagation of action potentials. Continuous propagation is conduction without the myelin sheath, which is slower. The faster one is saltatory propagation, which is jumping from node to node to node. Now, there's a threshold of an all or none phenomenon, which stimulates frequency of an action potential stimulus intensity. An axon hillock determines if there will be another action potential. A refractory period can be absolute or relative. The absolute refractory period is no matter what, no sending of another action potential can happen. It's already doing it. The relative refractory period is more difficult to send another action potential. And action potentials are always the same strength. Conduction velocities of an axon. Influence the diameter of a fiber and influence the myelin sheath, and the myelin sheath makes everything go faster. There are chemical and physical factors. The physical factors block nervous impulses, and the chemical one block impulses such as cold, pressure, and lack of blood flow. There are 3 types of fibers now: Group A, B, and C fibers. Group A fibers are fast and large and heavily myelinated. Group B fibers are smaller and lightly myelinated, which are pain. And C fibers are unmyelinated and slower, and that has to do with the autonomic nervous system. The synapse. Presynaptic versus postsynaptic. Types of synapses. There are electrical and chemical. The electrical synapses are also considered gap junctions, and chemical synapses are neurotransmitters such as acetylcholine. Neurotransmitters can open and close ion channels. Synapse organization is sectioned into 3 parts: axon terminals, synaptic clefts, and receptors. The synaptic cleft is fluid-filled space between neurons. The synapse continued. Information that transfers across a chemical synapse is excitatory. Arrival of an action potential depolarizes of the synaptic knob and calcium influx from the extracellular fluid. Then neurotransmitters are released by exocytosis. The neurotransmitter diffuses across the cleft and binds to the postsynaptic membrane, and then ion channels in the postsynaptic membrane open. Termination of the neurotransmitter effects, and they diffuse away from the synapse. A synaptic delay is the time it takes to close the synapse, which is the longest time period.
Postsynaptic potentials and synaptic integration. Excitatory synapses depolarize the axon hillock and make it more likely to fire, while inhibitory synapses hyperpolarize the axon hillock and make it less likely to fire. Summation is an additive effect. There are two types of summation, temporal summation and spatial summation. Temporal summation is when impulses happen close together. For example, enough bug footprints in one area will send an impulse. Spatial summation is when impulses or graded potential come from many places, such as rain droplets falling from the sky. Synaptic potentiation is warming up a synapse. Sometimes during presynaptic inhibition, one neuron will inhibit another one. In neuromodulation, other molecules can affect a neuron's firing, for example, hormones. Neurotransmitters and their receptors are classified by their chemical structures. Acetylcholine is an autonomic neurotransmitter found in neuromuscular junction and in central nervous system. It is excitatory and inhibitory. Biogenic amines are found in dopamine, serotonin, and norepinephrine. Amino acids, such as GABA, inhibits transmission of messages. Peptides are endorphins, which is the body's natural painkillers. Novel messengers are such as ATP, carbon monoxide, and nitric oxide. Basic concepts of neural integration. Neural pools are a group of neurons that combine incoming information, which sends off an action potential. There are 4 different types of circuits: diverging, converging, reverberating, and parallel after discharge. Diverging amplify the impulses. One neuron can fire up many more. Converging concentrate impulses. Several stimuli can cause the same effect. Reverberating is a positive feedback loop, such as breathing. Parallel after discharge is a burst of impulses. You would use this, for example, in problem solving.